And today we're going to look in John chapter 8, and we are going to take a look at the statement when Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." You know, the Bible talks a lot about light. In fact, as I was preparing for this message, it occurred to me to look that up, and the Hebrew word for light is used 43 times in the Old Testament. It is used 6 times in the book of Psalms, which means more of a poetic, more of a spiritual definition versus just the definition of light and darkness. The Greek word for light is used 60 times in the New Testament, and it is used 16 times in the book of John by itself. The word light in both the Hebrew and the Greek means a whole range of things. It means light, and it means darkness, and it means good, and it means evil, and it means ignorance or knowledge, righteous, unrighteous, life, death, truth or lies, godly or ungodly. One of my favorite verses out of the book of Psalms is one that we probably need to memorize in this time that we're dealing with this virus and thinking about all the things that may happen or what could happen next. And Psalms 27:1 tells us, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. In whom shall I be afraid?" And if you go over to John chapter 1, John sets the stage for light in connection to Jesus, and ultimately in our discussion today when he talks about being the light of the world. But over in John chapter 1 it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The true light that gives light to everyone has come into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made by him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God. The Word became flesh and dwelt," or actually the word means tabernacled among us. "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." John would talk a lot about light in his writings. But when you get to John chapter 7 and John chapter 8, and we're going to look at that passage in 8 in just a moment, we have to set the stage for something that you need to know. It's something that we need to pay attention to help us to understand what it is that Jesus was trying to communicate and what John was trying to record. When John is writing about Jesus there in Jerusalem, he is writing at the time that he knew that Jesus was in Jerusalem for a feast. Israel, according to God, according to the book of Leviticus, had to celebrate 7 feasts and 7 festivals. They were ways for God to remind Israel of who he was and what he did and how he moved in their lives. And every single feast, every single festival had a meaning, and they were to celebrate them over and over and over again. 3 of those feasts were what is referred to as pilgrimage feast. In other words, you had to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. And those 3 were Passover, they were Pentecost, and they were the Feast of Tabernacles. And Jesus is in Jerusalem now at the Feast of Tabernacles. Now that is significant. You may not think it's significant, but it is significant because if you understand what was happening at the Feast of Tabernacles, then you will understand what Jesus is saying when he says things like, "I am the light of the world." So as we look at that, let me just give you just a little bit of background. God told Israel that they were to, every so often, gather together and remember what it was like to be in in Egypt. And remember what it was like when God rescued them from Egypt and brought them into the promised land. And he said, the way you do this is at the time that I tell you to do it, at the place that I tell you to do it, which would ultimately be the temple, you are to gather together. You're to live in booths, in other words, or lean-tos or tents. You're to live in them for 1 whole week. You're to live in them and celebrate all that week long about how good my salvation has been to you. Now, it's interesting, as I was thinking about this, I realized that there's some information that you and I need to know. Jerusalem in Jesus' day was about 450 acres in size. That's not a big city, is it? There were about 50,000 people that lived in and around the city. So when God commanded them to celebrate the 3 feasts, and come to Jerusalem to celebrate that, then the population would swell. We don't have any accurate 100% numbers, but the population would swell, as some estimates said, between 150,000 people to 200,000 people. No one can verify these numbers, but we do know that Herod the Great was asked by the Israelites, by the Jewish people, to build a huge space, a huge courtyard out in front of the temple so that they could meet together and celebrate it. And one ancient source said this: the courtyard was large enough to have 100,000 people in it, and no one lacked for space or complained about the crowd. So in a town that is less than a square mile, there will be 100 to 150,000 people in that place living in lean-tos. Now think about this. When I was a kid, our Baptist Association, we had a ministry every Labor Day. And that ministry was at the Darlington Speedway. Now, if you're a race fan, you know all about the Darlington Speedway. It is the track that is too tough to tame. And it's a very popular track. It's an older track. And so we would go and we would set up a tent and we would offer cool drinks for people. We would have conversations with them, obviously share some tracks with them, talk to them about the Lord. And within a 5 square mile space, there were probably 50 to 60,000 people. And they were elbow to elbow. You had the sights of all the people. You had the smells. You can imagine how that is. You have all of that and how they were all crowded in there. And really, to be honest with you, it was kind of gross. So imagine 150,000 people in an area that's less than a square mile. Imagine that. And yet it was in that time that God said, you're to gather together and you are to celebrate my salvation, celebrate how I rescued you, celebrate how I restored you and made you my people. And in this celebration, in the Feast of Tabernacles, there were 2 ceremonies that I need to point you to. One ceremony was the water drawing ceremony. In this festival, every day the priest would go to the pool of Siloam, and they had a golden pitcher, and they would go down and they would take water and they would take it all the way to the temple and they would pour it onto the altar. Now, on the last day that they were doing this, the people were instructed to have a processional into the temple. And when the water was being poured out, they were to circle the temple 7 times, and they were to say, "O Lord, bring your salvation now." It was a cry of God to continue to do what he has always done, to continue to do even more, to rescue them, to bring the salvation that he has always promised to them. And the Bible tells us over in John chapter 7, you can go over there. John chapter 7, the Bible tells us that on that last and greatest day of the festival, on that last day, Jesus stood up in the crowd and in a loud voice he said, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from him." Most scholars believe that as the people were circling and as they were watching the water being poured out, that's when Jesus said in a very loud voice, "I am the one that you can come to if you are thirsty. I am the one that if you will believe in me, rivers of living water will be poured out from you." They believe, and I believe it as well, that that was one of the ways that Jesus got the people's attention. As they were talking and celebrating that water being poured out, he said what he said about the living water. But there's a second ceremony. And this is actually more important to our passage today. And that ceremony is called the illumination ceremony. Every night of the festival, there were four 75-foot candelabras, menorahs, that were in the temple courtyard. There were four. You had to climb up a ladder to get up there and light it. And they made this big celebration of that, and they lit the four candelabras, the four lights, and they lit them, and they celebrated and they sang and they danced. And there's one ancient source that said that there wasn't a courtyard in Israel or in Jerusalem that was not lit up by the light. Now imagine the lights being lit on those huge lamps. And then Jesus standing up and saying to the people, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. They will have the light of life." I think it would make an impact. I think it would have gotten the people's attention. Because you see, Jesus was claiming to be more than a good teacher. He was claiming to be more than a wise sage or a powerful prophet, or even claiming to be more than just a miracle worker. He was claiming to be equal to God, the light of God, the light of heaven. He was claiming basically that he was deity, that he was God in the flesh. Now, C.S. Lewis says this. He said either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he was a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him, and you can kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord, but let us not come with any of this patronizing nonsense about him being some great human teacher. He has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to do so. When Jesus stood during that celebration with the Feast of Tabernacles and proclaimed to be the light, he was proclaiming to be the Son of God. You see, that light was to represent God's Shekinah glory that the children of Israel followed when they were in the wilderness. It was also to represent God's salvation. It was called to represent how God brings knowledge to us and awareness to us. And so Jesus was basically saying, when you light those lamps, you're talking about me. And if Jesus is the light of the world, then there's some things that he is.